Okay, I think we're gonna start right now. Thank you everyone for joining us for an artist talk with Miami-based Gabriela Fernandez. My name is Ron Kinti Music, and I'm the founder and curator for Music. Is a virtual curatorial program for artists without gallery representation. I am so honored and happy to have Gabriela here with me, and I found her work through an open call for an artist feature. And for an artist feature, we're gonna have like a week-long social media feature on the artist, and then we end up with an artist talk. So, hello, Gabrielle. How are you?
I'm doing good.
That's so well, wonderful. I'm so honored to talk to you today. I'm excited to learn about your practice. How we're going to structure this talk is that Gabrielle has some time to talk about her art, her practice, and then we'll have kind of questions from me, and we're going to have questions from the audience. So, if you have any questions for Gabriella, you can either unmute yourself and just directly ask the question, or you can put in the chat box and I'll be kind of monitoring that. Um, I would like to formally introduce Gabriela to the audience. Gabriela Fernandez was born in Havana, Cuba, currently residing in Miami, Florida as a first generation immigrant, taking references from this multicultural, temporal, and migratory space. Exploring the process of this identification and the existence of manifested identifications in relation to time, ephemeral space, and the disoriented body. Exploring the existence of identity through the intersection of both trauma and nostalgia from an empathetic base. Looking at how the environment and unconscious movements affect the interaction between all, where the present body becomes a mirror to the associated symbiotic balance of the past and present. Let's see, give me a second. So in addition to the talk, we also have some crowdfunding tickets if you'd like to support Gabriela. Music provides a very modest honorarium to the artists, but if you like the talk and would like to support the artist, you can go to this link here, and you can purchase a ticket. And all the ticket sales directly go to the artist. And now, give me a second. I am gonna allow everyone to share screen. Okay, Gabriela, it's all yours.
Thank you, Norga. I also want to say thank you for the opportunity and giving space to all of us here to be able to experience this today. But so let me see here. Okay, let's see if this is working fine. Awesome. So before I go into specifics on about my work and in all its ways, like I do want to speak specifically about like the two aspects of where my work lies. I have a very large performative practice as well as one that specifically lies in cyanotype work, right? They do cross between each other from time to time, but specifically, they do have different philosophies when going into each other, right? My performative practice specifically is a very meticulous process where I'm looking specifically at the body as a vessel, specifically how my body as a vessel is now this conglomeration of these past bodies before me, and how now I myself as a vessel am pushing forward these certain entities that further move on these stories from them as well as my own experiences throughout, right? And one of the first instances of me going into performances was specifically looking at this work, which is titled Te limpias el piso conmigo. It's technically a term that we necessarily will see usually from a mother figure in turns to a child, right? The idea of an abuse of, let's say, that you drag me across the floor. So for the performance, I took specifically three trapos, right? Three frazadas in Spanish, where you specifically take these images of my mother and actually printing them on. So when actually doing the performance, I'm taking this image of her and transferring over and over and over again all across some walls. So as much as I'm trying to clean this area and trying to prove this essence of purity, which is a repeated element in my work for performance, what is this idea of purity and continuing the body in itself. It's actually looking at how, even with how much I'm trying to continue this image, all I'm doing is mudding this image further and further away from her, which is left then for what we have here, which is completely destroyed images, where they're weathered away from the original elements from what they were, right? And this later on leads me to probably one of my favorite works, which is La Ceremonia de la Doncella, right? So La Ceremonia de la Doncella is specifically looking at an old Yoruba culture that specifically is interested here in Cuba, but all across the Caribbean, which is looking at the idea of the period of sanction, right? As much as one wants to purify themselves over and over again, just the idea of constant repetition, constant action as we move on forward completely destroys ourselves. We go on forward and forward. So what I did for the performance is specifically looking at creating a centered object to forever cleanse myself and to always complete and repeat that action over and over again. So as much as I can go around and purify these certain areas and bless these certain areas to create these safe spaces for them, I'm also then myself taking away that purity. So I have to constantly be re-cleansing myself. And by re-cleansing myself, right, I'm creating this mummified object in this specific latex bed to consider myself now a show for those around. And that's something that I look a lot in performance work specifically. My performative objects and my performative work doesn't really exist in video. It only exists through images, which I do want to give a courtesy to the photographer who helped me document this work specifically, Gabriel Garland, who did an extraordinary job with this documentation, where specifically, I don't like video specifically for my performance work because I believe there's a specific experience that exists between the viewer and I when doing performative work. And once that is put into video, it's come this idea of repetition that can be easily caused over and over and again, where I lose control over what the elements of this performance goes to. But when I specifically have this all formed under myself, only these images now become the record of what happens. And the experience between me and the viewer will forever live on forward. With video, it becomes almost distant from what the original experience of actually being in that physical space and that physical time in itself, right? So again, with La Doncella, we're looking at the idea of mummification and how we're looking at this idea of how I constantly cleanse myself over and over again. Something looking at specifically even the orientation of my body in this almost pure form where I'm mummified for others to see. Something I even think about in itself when looking at performance work is what are the proportions of myself and the proportions of my body, right? Because that's something I believe you have to think about in a way with performances. Now the orientation of what the physical body is in space actually creates this new definition overall. Because if I were, say, in a different proportion, a different ethnicity, it all becomes new references and new combinations. That's why for myself, even I create strict practice in myself when doing performances where I have to be dressed in specific garments. I have to be dressed in a specific way. I go through specific rituals to go throughout it. And even myself where I avoid myself of any specific physical markings or bearings that can be attributed to something else. Because I want my body to be this extension for the viewer in itself, not this now newfound system. From then, La Ceremonia de Doncella, we get to a piece that I did specifically at Young Norfolk, which is called Bienvenidos a la Tropicana. Bienvenidos a la Tropicana is looking specifically at something exclusive, but it seemed repetitive throughout Latin America, which is something called jinetera. Jinetera is a term specifically in Cuba known for the idea of what we would attribute here as a sex worker. Specifically, the sex work for jineteras was done specifically for American men. And through these American men, this idea of disorientating their body for the pleasure of only these American. The idea of exotifying the Cuban body for an American audience. So the idea of being in Norfolk and being this disoriented body now in a more traditional American space where growing up in Miami, Florida, where everyone around me is brown, being in a space where, yes, in Norfolk, I was surrounded by a beautiful group of 25 other students that were all, for the most part, POC students that I, and to this day, have a super strong connection to, and like family. There's still this oriented thing of being these groups of people and these disoriented bodies in a community that is mostly white. So for the performance itself, I was specifically creating something traditional to the Cuban experience, which was a rumba, which is something usually traditionally practiced by a lot of jineteras, where in specifically clubs where American men would pass through, they would go in and actually create these dances for them, right? So creating this specific garment where I'm fully in the nude and with the rumba sleeves, I'm actually looking at the idea of spinning in myself and tracking this idea of the dance floor. So that means afterwards, the only thing that is left is actually the full movement of my body in that space and the markings and the trails of the outfit as it rips off me as I dance harder and harder all throughout it. Also throughout it, which I'll go back to it, I actually have a tiger's eye kegel, which tiger's eye specifically is an actual outsourced source from Cuba itself. It's one of the stones that naturally grows in Cuba. So by having the kegel in me while I'm dancing, there's an actual ring. There's a ring coming out of my body, out of those spells that I'm charming the new viewer and the new audience for it, right? And from here, specifically, having at the very end these four images to rimelize and reference specifically trading cards that jineteras in specific Cuba would give out to American audiences, because usually there was a reputation of people visiting. It was an idea of a remembrance to constantly come forward and go on with how everyone will remember them and to keep forward. So if a customer were to repeat themselves, they had that image of them to constantly come back to them specifically, losing ownership of their body to now this new image and this dance specifically for this audience. For this performance specifically, I also looked at the idea of how we're looking at text specifically through now a lens of distance and also generational, right? Because as much as I learned Spanish and English at the same time, we looked at this idea of how Spanish then transformed itself under a new tongue and a new generation, right? Looking at this idea of how myself, how I grew up with it simultaneously, and also from a Cuban dialect, which is already in self-distance from the Spanish dialect. There's this narrative of grammatical errors that exist, and it goes on forward and forward in my work where I don't really provide translations for people when looking at my work, because there's an idea of communication that I like, and the narrative of actually closing off a certain area for people, closing off an area where if you want to understand this text, you have to put in the effort to do so. I am not going to hand it to you, because in a way it's looking at the idea of even my family members and my community where we're not provided this idea of translations for each other, right? We're not provided the English translation when we go to museum, when we only speak predominantly Spanish. So why now do I have to provide an English translation for you if I speak in Spanish? There's a community aspect where, even specifically with this piece itself, I saw it when it was displayed at Norfolk, where people were asking each other what it meant to each other, and to see what the words meant for people who were native speakers. And that's necessarily a conversation that I enjoy in involvement. This idea of how one another can actually talk and speak to each other while not giving them the whole hand card of this is what it translates to. So from this, it actually led me to probably the last performative work I did before the pandemic. I do have some lined up, which I'm excited for, but with the pandemic, of course, there's new restrictions in how we can conduct performances and how everything can work in space. But uno ese del cuerpo caído, specifically looking at the idea of our body in space and technically how our body is an offering to specific saints. I grew up in a Catholic and Santero culture. So it's this mixed blend of what the idea of rituals and idea of shrines heavily exist in our features and our households. So from there, I looked at the idea of, well, what can create the ultimate offering other than the body? Of course, I can't sacrifice myself, but I can create recordings of myself, and those recordings can actually become these new elements that I can give to offerings to the saints. Specifically, the three saints that I look at in the piece are Santa Barbara, Santa Lazaro, and La Virgen Maria, which are all technically the saints of covenant members of my family. Specifically, I'm left to the middle of the vessel where I'm pouring hot wax on myself to actually create a recording of my body in a specific time. So when I peel off the wax, it's keeping myself in that current moment, because as we ever grow, our skin ever sheds, right? We're creating a new body of ourselves every single second. as a new feature of ourselves. So to create this ultimate sacrifice to the saints is giving my body in those specific moments, in those specific recordings to them, keeping it forward and forward as I'm technically burning skin away from myself to give towards them these layers and layers upon myself until I can't anymore. I had an assistant give the wax to me in these censored pods all across the garden to keep on pouring and pouring the wax until there was a culmination that my skin could not take anymore. Right? Whereas my skin's left raw red and there's no more recordings to give. I'm left with the piles and the aftermath of everything that's around me. And across it, my skin being recorded throughout all these different elements throughout it. And this specifically goes into something that I work into my 2D imagery work, which is mostly my cyanotype work, which is looking at kind of this idea of what piecing together on each other is, right? As a person myself, like I heavily archive work, I heavily archive my family's memories and family that all around me. I have to understand that as an immigrant, a lot of images of my family were lost and they can only bring what they can. So I've taken the active effort of actually archiving certain elements of what I've grown into as well as my family's been able to bring up. But through that, it's gotten up the interest of the idea of quilting and what the idea of quilting actually can connote to, right? There's a certain narrative that we can talk about in the idea of how quilting is forming a new sense of body and a new form of narrative as we work throughout this. And specifically with this work, Ave Maria is looking at the reflection of my mother, my grandmother, and I. The specific dynamic of creating a queen size quilt that is the acclamation of three heavy points in a female Latin American woman's life, saying specifically myself as a child, the birth, the quinces, which is when you're seen as a woman, as my mother, and then the wedding, which is the idea of when you give to yourself to a specific new feature, and that specific feature being my grandmother. That body then becoming a form in the middle, which is an image of all three of us together. This quilt then reflects to a quilt that's the size of a crib, which actually has the Ave Maria's words on it. A word and a song that my grandmother would speak to me every single night as we go forward. All throughout the quilt is using specific techniques that are all taught by me, right? Having a hand-sewed quilt that my grandmother passed down through me and looking at this generational ties, right? Quilt making is something that we've passed down generation to generation. But as we look into quilt making, right, and this idea of building narratives is where I have an interest moving on forward, right? As we look at quilt making and this idea of conversations, not necessarily can just be through this idea of sewing together, but looking as also as images can be kind of mosaicked together. Specifically, this work, we're looking at the idea of conversation, specific work rooted out of me being in the studio and my mother giving me a call at 4 in the morning because she had a dream about a time when it was just me and her due to my father leaving early on when he was leaving to the transition to the United States. Me and my mother were alone for 5 months. So this was her experience of my mother figuratively being a single mother, but her specifically looking at the idea of how what it was to raise someone such a distance, right? You're left with a child and now trying to culminate a relationship between two people where it might not exist the same way anymore. From there, we start looking at this idea of the pain that we all go through, an idea of the house as a head, right? That we can foster these ideas of what we have for one another in between each other, and these dreams now become these kind of distant memories as we try to push forward more and more what distance learning we have, right? Specifically in these like memories and what it speaks in the specific pieces talking about that first memory of that first night, where I wouldn't stop crying, where I wouldn't stop for no matter what, as long as she would like try to rattle me to sleep, as try to carry me, try to feed me, I wouldn't fall asleep. And she felt that type of first distant learning from each other where it's like, I will never be able to please her fully, and I'll fully be distanced from her. And looking at the idea of relationships kind of results back into the quilt. I'm sorry if I stutter. I have a slight lisp, so trying to get through it. But we have this idea that we move on forward, right? These talking narratives in between one another that technically leads to areas like this, right? Podar el Ramo is looking specifically at the high matriarchal in my family, which is my grandmother, right? Specifically with my grandmother before I became the role of archivist was specifically something that my mother and my grandmother would have. Specifically my grandmother at herself. My grandmother over time has now resulted in losing her own memory and her losing her own sense of time and what a timeline even it consists to. And then that reminded me of the idea of the phrase of like constantly cutting the hedge and constantly trimming one another to look at the idea of the full circle. Specifically, she always told me the tale of if a ceiba ever had a circle growing in it naturally. If someone were to cut it, it's a loss of someone's life. And now I want to create the personification of that specific tale, right? Having her life in the specific line where she in the middle is straight forward with her two painted shades, La Caridad de Cobre and Santa Barbara, where she's now left in these two middle grounds where she is now not in full view. She is now hidden from behind what we truly see her. We're only given fragments of what she truly is. And the circle around her specifically is not even a full completed circle, but now stitched together. Are these truly branches that link together and all in one, or do we lose full control of each other? Where is the new cut ever going to lie, and where is the new cut going to move forward towards as we create these new lines in between one another? These lines then destroy each other, unfolding how we go and move between each other, as well as how this destruction between this constant narrative of her memory. This memory will never return back to one another. And the plate specifically is looking at that. The plate is a proverb that specifically works and speaks on the idea of her memory as it disappears. Translating, I'll give the translation for this one, where it says caprice of your image, but in reality the event of you is a mirage. Where at one point she will completely lose herself and it will completely be an idea and a falsification of what she believes her identity to be because she no longer has control of it. Only left to now these other elements that go on forward. And all these elements and images have passed behind her, but now only exist between me and someone else. Specifically for this one, Bájate la cabeza is looking at the idea of punishment. The idea of punishment between one another as we look at the idea of how the body itself folds. Something I've always found interesting in a lot of my work, specifically with cyanotypes, is looking at the idea of how fabric moves. Fabric moving in space, I believe, gives an idea to more sculptural elements and the idea of how fabric in itself gives a blend and an air to it overall. So specifically with Bájate la cabeza, it's giving this idea of putting myself in a prayer motion without having to actually put my full body in itself. So the fabric now becomes performative in its space as we're looking at this idea of it bending towards itself and looking at the body bending to this unknown entity. As well as surrounding this body is these kind of abusive tones of what it is to bajarte la cabeza. Bajarte la cabeza in as a term that I grew up with, which is the idea of you can never look me in the eye specifically. You lowering your head to me and not looking me in the eye is the idea of you don't want to confront it and you're trying to hide away something. You're not truly trying to hide away, you're just trying to hide away your shame and get out of a situation. But the situation is non-existent. The situation is confrontational without a purpose. It's constantly putting forward this idea of constant change. And something I want to bring up specifically on why only cyanotypes, why only this work could have been printed out, this work could have been maybe painted in all these ways, but specifically with cyanotypes, there's a specific element that I like to exist where it could be this fantasy and this like of how I want to personify the idea in the process, but looking at the idea of how it's the sun that creates the image and it's the warmth specifically that creates this chemical reaction in the cyanotype chemicals almost can relate back to the warmth of the mother, right? Specifically, how my work is specifically working a lot of these domestic elements of the domestic family, that personification of how the warmth is what creates the image. This UV radiation, this warmth altogether, personifying to the warmth of the mother, I think works across this whole body, where I'm having all these elements of, even though the warmth that we attribute with red now giving us this powerful indigo blue, which is indigo is now fully also dismantling our ideas of how we see one another, because the blue can create such an idea of somber, an idea of elements where it's like you're just completely swallowed by this element of blue, because the blue now becomes this void where I don't see one another anymore because this blue is almost swallowing me whole. which leads to where more recent work that I've been going into, which is this is tac-tac. Tac-tac specifically is again looking at performative bodies, but looking at the idea of the same body being repetitive over and over again in its positions, right? And being now dismantled and puzzled. This is the same piece, but now it's just one side to the other. So depending on the side you see first, you're decided with this puzzled image of how we as ourselves now dismantle our bodies in these performative movements. And the performative movement is moving over and over again, creating new bodies and shapes and forms. Kind of relating back to Amanuenses del Cuerpo, where we're looking at this idea of constant recordings of ourselves. Now it's to take the recording of the body and actually dismantle it into pieces where we're no longer one of ourselves anymore. Which leads to the last work that I have in this presentation, which is Una zona del alma atravesada. This was a piece of my thesis work. Specifically for my thesis work, I was looking almost in the idea of ending a chapter. Ending a chapter specifically of this idea of what is my body now in relation to these familial chapters of myself. So for Una zona del alma atravesada, it's looking at the idea of actually piecing together the archives of my mother and my father in two separate quilts. How these two elements of ourselves, these two now bodies, are this agglomeration of both of them as they lead into myself and they lead into who I am. As this idea of themselves and their growth and how their growth has now affected mine. How this idea of several conflicts and several elements where they might see themselves as distant, but now when put into these two actual elements in physical bodies and space, you now look for the similarity of who they are in between each other, what experiences, what images can actually be into one place. And this idea goes back into the idea of the cyanotype of the amalgamation of all this blue. To be surrounded by such a blue in such a large setting becomes overwhelming and you almost feel like you're drowning specifically. Almost the idea of the personifying being in a shower and being drenched by water over and over again as you reconcile what's happened before in your past. And from that past, we see these repetitions happen with ourselves and we start to lose ourselves. Because at some point in these quilts, the images start to blur themselves into actual elements of water, where the steam in itself loses one another as we wipe ourselves anew. And as much as I want to distance myself from other features and other archives of myself, my body and my vessel will always continue forward in that, and I can never wipe that fully. That's my presentation.
Well, Gabriela, thank you so much for preparing that presentation. And it's just also amazing. I want to say with the science tab, just to share a little bit of my thoughts, because when you're talking about how you talk about the sun and the warmth of the mother, also thought about the passage of the day, like the time moving, like when the sun sets and the sun rises to create these chemical reactions for the cyanotypes. You talk a lot about time, the passage of time, how like the one piece with your grandmother and memory, with your body moving. So I thought like sun and setting, rising, also the warmth, but also the somberness and the blue. I thought that was all really touching and really amazing. I do have a couple of questions. Also, by the way, if anyone have questions, you can always put it in the comment section, and we can have Gabriela answer them. Um, First thing I want to ask is a very broad question. I know that in school, where performance is not really something you take a class in. Well, maybe there's some classes, there definitely are classes now, but it's not really something like in high school or middle school you do performance. So how do you get into performance work?
Well, interesting enough, this is a conversation that I've had with like multiple people before, where it's like, oh, how does one like enter into performance? How does one come into it? Specifically, there's this weird element that exists, I believe, when you come from lower income areas. Because specifically, I didn't go to like a traditional art school. I went to a regular high school for the most part, maybe taking a few like AP classes at the very end of my like high school trip. But performance specifically is kind of something I naturally fell into. Of course, like later on, I learned about the works of like Ana Mendieta, which is a and your on Rainer, which is something that we usually see, especially when you're learning about performance, especially if you're Latin American. Usually the title they give you is like, oh, you do performance work. It's like ana mendieta. But with me, I was kind of looking a lot at the work of Maria Magdalena Campos Bon, where she specifically is looking at the idea of fragmenting, right? And how we fragment image overall, which can come through actually, he even speaks about it, where it's looking at the idea of how, as ourselves, we can only limit it to the materials we have. And I think just naturally, as being someone who is TLC, you become already interested in the idea of performative because you kind of conduct a performative activity every day, where there's specific elements where you're constantly performing for one another. Where I think, to be honest, where performative and being in a performance is something that everyone does and conducts in every single day. Just someone doesn't necessarily name it as that. We just are used to this idea of like kind of like white cubing that, oh, performative work looks a certain way and acts a certain way. Performative work really cross blends that. Like I naturally fell into it because just through work and studying and thinking about what is the best body for these forms and these narratives to come out of, where does it house best, it came into performance. But when looking back at it, I can think about just elements of interactions between people and conversations that was a performance in as well. And there's certain ways that like in certain people that I might create a performance towards because there's a certain narrative that I want to come across, if that makes sense.
Oh, does anyone have questions they would like to unmute themselves and right now before I ask the next question? Okay.
I'll ask a question.
Okay. Okay, Juan. Hey, ask a question.
Hello. Hi, Gabby. I really enjoy your fabric pieces that you have been doing, the ones that I've seen in person and the ones that you've done since. And I'm really wondering about how you think about the objecthood of these pieces. You talk about some of them being like trapos or quilts, and I believe that trapos were like actual like rags that your mom used to clean, and some of them just look like fabric that you might have like purchased. So, how do you go about choosing the fabric that you use, and how do you think about like the objecthood of these fabric pieces?
Well, as for specific fabric choices that I go through, I think I do a lot of like collection where I kind of everywhere I'm looking, I'm constantly collecting objects and collecting objects that exist around me. So some of the fabric might be purchased, but that fabric that I purchase usually I might not necessarily use it at that specific project or that specific element, and I just might specifically collect it because of an interest in materiality. Because as much as like I do have like a lot of narrative based work and narrative based roots, I look in also what materials can signify and what bodies they can create. I think also just in the forms of how they fall into. I think about everyday activities and the idea of how those everyday ideas and chores like work into the idea of how these objects like can then fold themselves into like the idea of like una zona, how they're draped upon each other almost replicates back to like when you hang something to dry, like as a, for a towel and stuff like that. Because but that's specifically the borders of those whole huge quilts specifically are all made out of towels because of that element of like how they're hanging over. So I specifically think of like how fabrics are specifically used and what those fabrics are in their context to what the specific images and specific elements that I'm working towards.
Do we have additional questions from the audience? I just want to bring up a, I guess, observation from the Roomba piece. You had the four dancing figures, and you had the Roomba slaves on the floor. Because you also have the text in Spanish. I thought I heard from throughout the talk that you kind of like, oh, you don't feel like the need to translate or like spoon fed the audience of what the text meant. But in that particular piece, because the dance was particularly geared towards the American audience, we had the Spanish text. So it's kind of like interesting to see these two ideas kind of not also like have like converge a little bit, but also like diverge. So I thought like that's very like poignant because you have the piece, some of the piece is directly towards a non-Spanish speaking audience, but you have the text that accompanies it that you don't feel the need to translate for it. So I thought it's very poignant.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the specific like reasoning for that comes out of like the idea of when you're outsider in that sense, where like a lot of these women didn't know really any words of like English at all. Maybe a few instances of hi, hello, how are you? That language between them was kind of the one element for them to have safety between one another and house themselves between one another, because these American men really only were there for the body. So even though that text exists on the floor, it of course is going to make people back off if they don't know it. And they'll only say specifically work and look at the body because they're like, oh, well, I don't understand the text. I'm not going to put the effort towards the text because I don't understand the language. So why am I not doing? There's no translation for it. So I'm just going to move forward and specifically look at the body. But that in a way, it's still speaking back to these women where they speak between one another and they might be speaking towards these American men specifically about them, but they don't give the time and respect for those words and what their actions are saying. They specifically just want to focus on the body in that moment.
Yeah, because like the body, when you have the body of those pieces, it seems like it's easier just for the audience to just decipher these dancing bodies with the roomless sleeves, as opposed to what the kind of text meant. So it's almost like you're like for the audience, you're isolating like one half of the piece, and you're focusing on the piece that's easily accessible. So I thought that was very beautiful and cool. But I think I am most curious about the piece when you like almost looking like in a wedding dress, but you're like kind of trying to purify yourself, and you had maybe some sort of a vinyl or some kind of a latex piece on like top. So like how can you explain more about how that performance like went? Like how what happened to your body?
Well, specifically for that piece, for the say, I was looking at basically how we as ourselves kind of look at purified objects. The garment I have looks like a wedding dress. It also is something that's very traditional for women in Yoruba culture. A lot of women in Yoruba culture wear all white, specifically when they're made also as a saint. As a saint themselves, they're supposed to wear white traditionally every single part of their day. It's a part of their ceremonial practice where they have to wear white because they're kind of seen as these kind of physical body stains now in our present day living among us. So what they do is technically this idea of constantly purifying the areas that they're around, right? And they do a lot of this through a conglomeration of kind of giving them themselves the sins of others and the sins that surround them and their energy around it, which in a way, what I did in that space was doing that. I was blessing certain elements around them, blessing certain areas, blessing the garden that was all around us for that specific location, because that specific location that it was conducted in was in the Kampong, which historically enough is David Fairchild's first home here in the United States. So it's a garden where technically all the vegetation that exists there isn't from the United States. It's technically some of the first vegetation from the tropical and subtropical areas that he brought to the United States and then made kind of as a natural element for it. So technically these elements and these plants there are kind of in a way now dirty because they're taken from their new homes. So I saw in a way of to take the task of purifying these areas and the history that this house holds. But by doing that, I need to cleanse myself and I need to constantly purify myself. And then looking at the idea of Yorubas, when they specifically pass away, they encase themselves in this case, not vinyl. They use specific blessed cloths that they're wrapped around and then burned and taken to the sea, because the Yoruba culture is specifically looking at the sea in itself. When I'm put into the latex bed, it's kind of encasing my body and leaving nothing. It's leaving myself and my vessel as it pure looks like. Because as much as I might can walk around and I can see and everyone sees me visibly, when I'm now left on that bed, I'm left vulnerable. I'm left vulnerable to anyone around me, and I'm left only to the elements of the light and that bed to fully enclose me and purify me fully. If not, I'm left to constantly receive the dirt and the backlash of the areas that surround me.
Yeah, I really relate to that notion of like purity, but also like dirtiness and filthiness, because it seems like you're purifying yourself, but in essence, you to the outsiders, you kind of look like devoid of life. So I like this idea of like you have to be like to be pure. It's almost like it brings you to the point where you're almost like skin and bones. So I don't know, like is that a question like is maybe that too extreme, or like purity and purity or filth or cleanliness? Like I don't know. It's a very I think it's a very interesting topic. Um, I'm gonna have one last question for Gabriela, but we're kind of like starting to close up the talk. Does anyone else have any questions? You can unmute yourself. I have my one question I have for Gabriela is what I know, especially do more performative work, and you might like want an audience, but with the pandemic being over, like what is next for you? What is next for you and your art career?
Well, thankfully, this summer, I'm actually going to the Franconia Sculpture Park. So technically, I have some performances lined over there where I'm actually looking at the idea of now the body as it relates to octave ranges. So now the body as also an instrument, right? So I've looked at the idea of as a vessel as now to show these elements. So now it's what is it to take the history and actually create an instrument of the body in this creation throughout it, as well as a performance that I have lined up towards more the second half of the year that's actually looking at the idea of projection of hair and how hair is as a projection, this extension and recording of ourselves. But it's also an idea of torture and also kind of pleasure and how those intertwine between each other as we move on forward. But that's so far what's in the future. I hope there's more in the future coming, but we can never know with the pandemic. But
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, especially when you're not doing as much like object-based work during the pandemic, it's definitely difficult for the performing arts a lot, because you need the audience. And I'm just so I admit I'm a little bit hesitant of performance work, because I've seen like the ones I've seen, like I'm not sure I like this, but I think when I saw your work and your documentation, I think it definitely changed, at least for me, my mindset that performance work, it just could be like 2D work, 3D work, like go either way. And I think you're really onto something, and you can make great waves now and in the future. So thank you so much, Gabriela, for giving us your time and energy for this talk. I appreciate it a lot.
thank you. I appreciate it again. And I do want to say thank you again for giving me the space to talk about my work and being so communicative and giving the space to people like me and Juan, who's also in this call. And I want to thank everyone else who also came to see the talk. You guys are all wonderful people. And I hope you guys
Thank you.
great.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good, fabulous Sunday, and see y'all later. Bye.
See you guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.